If you live in the Russian Federation, let's say in a town like Nirangri in the Far East, 5,000 miles from the front line, the war in Ukraine just got real. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin announced his partial mobilization. So over the last 24 hours across towns and cities in Russia, some of the 300,000 eligible reserves started leaving home. It's partial mobilization because for now applies to men who once upon a time completed mandatory conscript service and have combat experience, according to the Russian defense minister. It doesn't feel very partial to the child in the background, though, watching their father board the bus. At a recruitment centre in Dagestan, different emotions. Tempers flare between those called up and an ethnically Russian military official.
Мой сын нам сначала с самого февраля воюет. Не надо было. Надо было. Это мой долг. Если надо, я пойду. Сама тоже иди. Пойду. Я не пойду. Мой дед воевал, чтоб ты терпел и кушал. Мой дед воевал за мою родину. Это совершенно за мою родину воевал. Это была война. А сейчас нет. Это политика сейчас. Послушай женщину, мужчина.
Given the politics, you have to be brave to take to the streets of the 40 or so Russian cities and towns where people protested against the war and mobilization. Over 1,300 people were detained yesterday. There were reports that people detained were being served with draft papers. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov did not deny that when asked about it today. He also reasserted the Kremlin logic for the mobilization itself.
Сейчас де-факто нам противостоит фактически нам противостоит блок НАТО со всеми их логистическими возможностями. Это привело к такой необходимости.
Здравствуйте, Николай.
The Peskov family were in the news for other reasons today. Hosts of an opposition radio station claimed to have pranked his son, Nikolai Peskov, by pretending to be recruitment officers, calling him up for action.
Вы это самое, 10 утра, естественно, завтра я не приеду. Вы должны понимать, если вы знаете, что я господин Песков, да. Насколько это не совсем правильно, чтобы я там находился. Короче, я буду это решать я буду это решать на другом уровне, как бы если это...
If that was Nikolai Peskov, and we can't be sure it was, it speaks to something bigger about the nature of this mobilization. Look at where the images we showed you earlier come from. The first one is from Nirangri, the Sakha Republic in the Far East. This one is from Blagoveshchensk, which borders China. The confrontation scene with the official is in Dagestan. In other words, so far this stage of the mobilization appears to favour men from the poorer ethnic republics. We have not yet seen scenes like these in affluent downtown Moscow. It could be months before the men being called up now have any real impact on the battlefield. But remember, this is happening because Russia is not winning the war. The mobilization, in other words, smacks of failure. And in the Kremlin, that means weakness. The question then, how long will those around the strong man tolerate that?
Well, I'm joined now by our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, who's in President Zelensky's hometown in Ukraine, and our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy, who's at the UN General Assembly in New York. First, Lindsay, so despite President Putin's escalatory actions this week, he's agreed to this major prisoner swap. What do we know about who Ukraine has got back?
Well, we had the foreign prisoners who got back yesterday. That was organised through Saudi Arabia, including 5 Britons now back in the UK, and more than 200 Ukrainians, some of whom have gone to Turkey. It was Turkey that organised this. But most of them are members of the Azovstal regiment. Now, those were the people who President Putin described as neo-Nazis. A lot of the Russian propaganda has been about these men. They were the ones who defended the steelworks in Mariupol. They're seen as great heroes to Ukrainians. But some of the nationalistic Russian bloggers are furious about this because they were told that these people were the worst of the worst and the reason that they were fighting Ukrainians. And yet, here they are. They've been released.
So tell us now about who the Russians got in exchange.
This has made some Russians even angrier. So there are 55 Russian soldiers, police officers and so on. But the main person is a Ukrainian politician called Viktor Medvedchuk, very close to President Putin. So close, in fact, that President Putin is his younger daughter's godfather. And he was really President Putin's way into Ukrainian politics in the old days. But he's not a well-known or popular figure in Russia. President Zelensky wanted them to take him months back. He was arrested here for treason and has been held for some time. The Ukrainians are only too happy to get rid of him. But it seems that President Putin wants him for personal reasons. He's not going to stand trial there as he would have done here in Ukraine. So it's almost as if we're back to Louis XIV, l'état c'est moi, the state is me. And President Putin, apparently at the moment, not making a distinction between his own personal interests, getting his friend back, and the interests of the Russian state.
Lindsay, thanks very much. Well, at the United Nations General Assembly, America's Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged all Security Council members to send Russia a clear message that these reckless nuclear threats must stop immediately, as he put it. Let's get more from Siobhan Kennedy in New York. Siobhan.
Well, it had all the makings of a big showdown at the UN Security Council today. It was a meeting of the world's top diplomats, the Foreign Secretary of the US, Antony Blinken, of France, of Ukraine, James Cleverly. The UK Foreign Secretary was there too, and there was a real expectation that fur might fly because they would be sitting around the same table as Sergei Lavrov, Russia's Foreign Secretary, a day after, of course, Russia threatened Ukraine and therefore the rest of the world with potential nuclear war. But guess what? Sergei Lavrov turned up an hour late. He didn't bother to listen to any of his counterparts. He said his piece and then he upped sticks and off he went. And what he did say in his speech was the usual string of wild allegations about neo-Nazis taking over Kyiv and what he called an attempt to impose a different narrative where Russia is the aggressor. Well, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, I think really crystallized the feeling in the room and in the West when he said this: if Russia stops fighting, he said, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. Well, yesterday I caught up with Ukraine's foreign minister and he assured me that Ukraine would not stop fighting. Let's listen to that interaction now.
We are defending our country and we will continue doing it.
Do you think you can win?
We will.
And what's your reaction, though, to what Putin has said to the deployment of hundreds of thousands of more troops?
He is throwing more Russian men into the fire of war, which means that he doesn't care about them. He doesn't care about his own people. But this decision is an act of desperation for him, and it will not change the situation on the ground. He's going to lose and we're going to win.
Well, all those sitting around the table at the Security Council today agreed with that statement that this was a desperate move by Russia, and that's really why they don't see the need to change their strategy other than to keep supplying Ukraine with money and military equipment, because as the State Department told me yesterday, quite simply, they believe that is working. Yes, they would like to be able to throw Russia from the permanent membership it has of the Security Council, but that isn't going to happen anytime soon. So for now, it's business as usual. The same strategy applies.
Siobhan, thanks very much. Krish.
Well, earlier I spoke to retired US Army General David Petraeus, who was also director of the CIA, and I began by asking him how the West is supposed to deal with a nuclear threat from the Russian president.
Well, I think you have to take it seriously, but I don't assess it as being all that likely, frankly. The use of, say, a tactical nuclear weapon would not change the dynamics on the battlefield. If anything, they might actually reinforce Ukrainian determination to fight on. They would undoubtedly push the West into even more sanctions against, in fact, Putin himself, perhaps. In fact, even, again, war crimes charges and so forth. And they would not have a demonstrable effect on what is a disastrous situation on the battlefield for Russia. The truth is that Putin is in a very desperate situation, which is why he is resorting to these kinds of threats, why he has had this partial mobilization, which isn't going to change the situation for many months, if at all. It's not clear that how many of these reserves will actually report for duty, whether they will be fit, how much training they will need, whether the equipment is there for them, and all the rest of this.
I mean, it's interesting that you even countenance the idea of using tactical nuclear weapons. What would be the right response were that to happen, or if some other weapon of mass destruction, chemical weapons, or a strike on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant were to be carried out by the Russians?
These threats are his attempt to try to mitigate that risk, but I don't think it's going to work. I don't think he will use them. And even if he did, again, they would not reverse the fortunes of the Russians on the battlefield, and they would result in much more costs for Russia in a variety of different ways. And among those might be how the West might respond. It wouldn't even have to resort to nuclear weapons. It could literally take out all of the Russian forces of any size and substance still in Ukraine.
Right, and if the West were to decide that as a result of these threats, the war in Ukraine needs to be accelerated, it needs to be won quicker, is there anything more it could do without entering the war itself?
Clearly, anything that can be done to shore up the Ukrainian air defense, ballistic missile defense, and so forth would be very helpful. And I know that actually Western countries are working to do just that. The challenge is, as always, being that the West doesn't have the systems that are compatible with the essentially sort of old Russian or Soviet bloc systems that Ukraine has and that some of the Eastern European countries have given to Ukraine. So that effort presumably is ongoing. So is the effort to provide additional of the ammunition that has proven to be particularly valuable, the very precise 70-kilometer range rockets that have been taking out the Russian headquarters, ammo supply points, fuel depots, barracks, troop assembly areas, and so forth, which have been devastating.
And just finally, I mean, you know, we know that Putin's Russia have tried to meddle in the domestic politics of the West, and it's disputed to what extent they've been successful. Does NATO do the same in Russia?
The difference, I think, between NATO doing that and what Russia does is that we try to tell the truth. And so it's a huge difference over the kind of blatant misinformation, disinformation, propaganda that Russia employs. And so, again, I think the Western countries hold themselves to a much higher standard when they're engaging with the press than certainly does a country like Russia.
General Petraeus, thank you very much indeed.
Great to be with you, Christian. Thank you.